I don't have to test because you know, right? Okay. Good morning. I want to call the Thursday, May 26, 2016 meeting of the Delta Stewardship Council to order, and we will begin with the roll call, beginning on my far right.
General here.
Brown here.
Fiorini here.
PFO here.
We have a quorum, and we are about to add one more. It's my pleasure to introduce and swear in our newest council member, Ken Weinberg. Ken is from San Diego, has been appointed to the Delta Stewardship Council by Governor Brown. Weinberg has been an adjunct lecturer at California State University San Marcos and principal and owner at Ken Weinberg Water Resources Consulting, LLC since 2015. He served in several positions at the San Diego County Water Authority from 1991 to 2015, including Director of Water Resources Supervisor, and Water Reclamation Supervisor. Weinberg was a project manager at the City of San Diego Engineering and Development Department from 1987 to 1991. He earned a Master of Public Administration degree from San Diego State University. It's an honor, Ken, to have you join us. If you could come forward at this time, I'd like to administer the oath of office to make it official. So repeat after me. I, Ken Weinberg,
I, Ken Weinberg,
do solemnly swear
do solemnly swear
that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States
that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States
and the Constitution of the State of California
and the Constitution of the State of California
against all enemies,
against all enemies,
foreign and domestic, that I will bear true faith and allegiance
that I will bear true faith and allegiance
to the Constitution of the United States
to the Constitution of the United States
and the Constitution of California,
and the Constitution of California,
that I take this obligation freely
that I take this obligation freely
without any mental reservation
without any mental reservation
or purpose of evasion,
or purpose of evasion,
and that I will well and faithfully discharge
and that I will well and faithfully discharge
the duties upon which I am about to enter.
the duties upon which I am about to enter.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Welcome aboard.
Thank you.
Stay with the name tag.
Didn't the governor have a second appointment too?
The governor did have a second lesser appointment. That would be me, and I'm honored to have been asked to serve 4 more years, and I considered a privilege and honor. So you will have me around for another certain amount of time. Ken, would you like to say anything before we proceed?
Okay, thank you. Just really briefly, I am honored and humbled to have been appointed by the governor to this body, and really appreciate it. I also understand what it now means to say esteemed colleagues. You are all a very impressive group, and I have heard wonderful things about the staff, and I'm really looking forward to doing whatever part I can do to help fulfill the mission. So thank you, and I'm really looking forward to serving with you, and I know it's going to be a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken. And for our next agenda item, we will recess to closed executive session. This will likely be a prolonged executive session. For those of you that are following on the webcast, I expect that we probably will not be reconvening until 10 o'clock or later. But we'll use 10 o'clock as the target time for now. We are now in recess for closed session. Good to go, Bob? Thank you. We are reconvening in open session. There was no action taken in closed session. And once again, for those of you that have joined us since 9 o'clock, welcome to the meeting. We will begin with an action item, file item 5, adoption of the April 28th, 2016 meeting summary.
Mr. Chairman, I would move the minutes as they've been presented by staff.
PIFO moves, Johnston second. Any discussion? Pat? Vote?
Brown eye. I'm sorry.
Weinberg, aye.
Fiorini, aye.
PIFO, aye.
Motion passes unanimously. Thank you for that. Having just returned from closed session where we discussed Judge Kenney's recent ruling regarding the integrity of the Delta Plan, let me report that I am pleased that the court's decision endorsed the legally enforceable structure of the 2013 Delta Plan and held that it was based on best available science. While we as a council continue to study all of the nuances of the complex decision, we have directed staff as a matter of top priority to continue its ongoing effort to develop and circulate for public comment high-priority Delta Plan amendments, including one that would promote options for new Delta conveyance, storage, and the operations of both to achieve the co-equal goals. As we said that we would do in the Delta Plan and as the court directed. Last month was a particularly busy time for me with several presentations and chairing the May 9th Delta Plan Interagency Implementation Committee meeting. I was privileged to provide a keynote address at the Aqua Spring Conference at the Friday morning breakfast. I took that opportunity to review how the Delta has been altered for many well-intentioned reasons and described many of the challenges that we now are dealing with because of the unintended consequences of those well-intentioned actions. I described the unique role of the Delta Stewardship Council and provided a summary of the guidance provided in the Delta Plan and the Delta Science Plan. My concluding remarks touched on reasons to be optimistic about the future Delta and the co-equal goals. Certainly there's a lot to be concerned about, many needs, but it's good to report from where I sit. I see an increasing amount of cooperation and communication by stakeholders and state, federal, and local agencies. Sure, progress is slow, but there are successes to celebrate. Recently, the Memorandum of Understanding signed by state, federal, and local agencies with responsibilities for the Yola Bypass Cache Slough Complex is a commitment to work cooperatively together for multi-benefit, multi-project approach that is called for in the Delta Plan. Recently, the Contra Costa Water Agency and the California Department of Water Resources entered into an agreement. I'm unsure as to when that takes place, but the good news is that we have local agencies and state agencies communicating and working through their differences. Another reason to be optimistic was the discussion among 17 state and federal agency leaders about recent achievements by their agencies at the most recent DPIC meeting on May 9th. Thank you to council members Patrick Johnston, Judge Frank Damrell, and Susan Tatayan for attending. Jessica Law, our DPIC coordinator, will provide you with more details in just a couple of minutes. But I want you all to know that I'm pleased with the progress the Delta Science Agency Work Group has made, for the progress that the Eco Restore projects are experiencing, and for the discussion we had at DPIC about the new paradigm of adaptive management for the Delta, all supportive actions of the co-equal goals. At this time, I'll call on Jessica Law to provide you with a few more details regarding the May 9th Delta Plan Interagency Implementation Committee meeting. Jessica, welcome.
Thank you, Chair Fiorini, and I also wanted to express my thanks to all the council members who attended the meeting. It was a good discussion around the table, and I think Randy has a few of the remaining coasters that we handed out. No state funds were used to produce those.
Let's see. Mary got some, so I'll pass them.
It seems that they're in pretty high demand, so there might be a second run happening later.
Coasters printed at no state expense.
Yes. So anyways, I just wanted to go over a few highlights from the meeting. The majority of the discussion was really focused on adaptive management, and it followed on the three presentations that happened at the meeting on the topic. So Dr. John Weens, a member of the Delta Independent Science Board, presented the recent adaptive management report that the ISB produced. David Okita from the California Natural Resources Agency provided an update on EcoRestore, and Christopher Chenell, also from the California Natural Resources Agency, provided an update on the Yolo Bypass and Cache Slough partnership. As Chair Fiorini mentioned, they talked about the recent MOU that was signed on the Yolo Bypass partnership. This is a significant event, and it really it marked good progress made between the state and the federal agencies on the project, and the MOU will help further projects that strengthen and set back levees, remove barriers to fish passage, sustain agricultural operations, and then make it easier for salmon to rear in the Sacramento River. And all of these are really key elements of the Delta Plan's ecosystem restoration recommendations. A lot of the questions from committee members focused on how EcoRestore is addressing some of the challenges of implementation of adaptive management, especially for financing and monitoring. Mr. Okita at the meeting talked about how EcoRestore is looking at a regional monitoring approach that can be shared by everyone doing restoration, and that model will address a topic that was raised by Councilmember Pifo on cost-benefit analysis. He also talked about EcoRestore projects and how they're funded mostly by the state water contractors, which provide a source of long-term funding per the requirements of the biological opinions. So that was an important topic that came up, and it was directly related to the ISB's recommendations in their report. So the DP committee members thanked David Okita and Christopher Turnell for their efforts and especially for their leadership on these projects. At the end of the meeting, Mike Chikowski from the USGS gave a preview of the nationally recognized Science Enterprise Workshop, as we're calling it, which is planned for later in 2016. This workshop is going to bring together experts from various science enterprises around the country, Puget Sound, Florida Everglades, the Great Lakes, Louisiana coast, and talk about how science is managed, funded, and then synthesized in these respective regions. So there will be lots more to discuss on this workshop. Myself and many of the staff from the Delta Science Program are going to be involved in shaping and putting together the conference. So we're very excited. DPIC committee members were also excited and encouraged about the potential outcomes from the workshop. And I just wanted to sort of summarize some of the general encouragement that we received from the committee members. In particular, Letty Beeland, Senior Counsel to the Deputy Secretary of the Interior, remarked at the beginning of the meeting that there really had never been a greater need to grow in the same direction, and that DPIC really plays an important role in interagency coordination in this respect. And then later in the meeting, Mark Cowan, the Director of California Department of Water Resources, said that this is the best game in town and we ought to double down. So I'll leave you with that. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Any questions of Jessica? As you may recall, Jessica entered employment here just literally a few weeks before the DPIC meeting that she has primary responsibility for, and did a wonderful job. It's great to be working with you, and thank you for the good work in preparation for May 9th and all the ongoing follow-up that will occur.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, that completes my report. We're on now to file item 7, Executive Officers Report. Jessica?
Okay, thank you. Well, I'll start with just a few current events. The State Water Board last week adopted a statewide water conservation approach that replaces the emergency percentage reduction-based conservation standard with a new localized stress test approach, and this approach requires urban water suppliers to ensure that they have at least a 3-year supply of water for their customers under drought conditions. And if they can't document that, then their customers must conserve the difference. So this is a definite switch between sort of a top-down numeric standard, which some decried was too one-size-fits-all, to a new approach that's kind of an outcome-based approach. So we'll see how that goes in implementation. Meanwhile, 70% of the state today remains in severe, extreme, or exceptional drought, and the Sierra snowpack is still at less than normal for this time of year. Last week, the San Francisco Estuary Partnerships Implementation Committee approved the 2016 Comprehensive Conservation and Management Plan. They call it the CCMP. The partnership is one of many national estuary programs that's established under the Clean Water Act to promote collaboration across federal, state, and local agencies, and also nonprofit organizations in order to protect and restore estuaries across the United States. Their management plan, which they adopted in 1993 originally and last updated in 2007, is really a collaborative agreement about what should be done to protect and restore the San Francisco estuary, including the Bay and the Delta. And you should know that council staff served on the steering committee for the 2016 update, and as a result of our participation, the list of priority tasks in this CCMP now includes better representation of Delta-specific actions as described in the Delta Plan, as well as actions that need to be coordinated across the entire estuary. So that's a positive step there. On May 5th, the state and federal contractors water agency certified that its Tule Red tidal restoration program in the Sassoon Marsh is consistent with the Delta Plan. The proposed project would restore approximately 420 acres of what is now managed brackish wetlands owned by Westervelt Ecological Services and the Department of Fish and Wildlife. And it'll be restored to tidal habitat, which would benefit federally and state-listed Delta smelt, longfin smelt, and salmonids. The public has 30 days or until June 4th to review the certification on our website. This project would partially fulfill the 8,000-acre tidal restoration obligations of various biological opinions. Tule Red is also part of the Eco Restore program. So as always, I like to report out on letters of significance that the staff has sent in order to either memorialize conversations that we've been having with other state, local, or federal agencies to encourage Delta Plan implementation or overall coordination. This month, there's just one letter. It was comments that we provided to DWR on the draft Sacramento River Basin-wide feasibility study. This study is being developed by the department to evaluate options for improving the Sacramento Valley's flood bypass system, including the Yolo, Sacramento, and Sutter bypasses. So this study analyzes 5 different alternatives for the Yolo bypass, including one developed with local stakeholders. And DWR is developing a similar San Joaquin River Basin study to evaluate options for improving flood management there. These 2 studies will be used to support the preparation of the 2017 update to the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan. I've been asked to make a plug for Delta E-News, which is DWR's weekly electronic newsletter that provides news on behalf of many agencies working on projects and programs in the Delta. It's a helpful compendium of Delta agency activity, meeting notices, reports, etc. They often highlight the work that we're doing here at the council. And if you're here today and want to subscribe, you can simply leave your email with Pat Rogers, our clerk, or if you're watching online, you can send an email to Eric Alvarez on our staff, who's listed on our website under staff contacts. Buried in the lead scientist report is the notation that lead scientist Cliff Dahm received the 2016 Award of Excellence from the Society for Freshwater Science at its meeting this week in Sacramento. Cliff was honored for being a deep thinker, both in the literal and the figurative sense. The award is given for outstanding contributions to benthic science, which is the study of the lowest level of a body of water's ecological region. So Cliff can tell you more about the annual meeting and his keynote address to the 1,000 attendees on Saturday night, but I wanted to publicly appreciate him for his outstanding academic career and note how fortunate we are to have him here with us. I think with that, I'll pause and call up our legislative advisor, Ryan Stanbrough, for an update.
Good morning, and welcome, Councilmember Weinberg. This month's report includes an update on bills in Sacramento dealing with water markets and stormwater capture, the governor's release of the May revise, a few updates from Capitol Hill pertaining to drought legislation and the Westlands drainage settlement, and I'll conclude with a discussion on a regional initiative that will be on the June 7th ballot that focuses on addressing sea level rise through ecosystem restoration. Starting here in Sacramento, Assemblymember Rich Gordon, who represents portions of the South Bay, is authoring AB 2594, which aims to increase the resiliency of the state's water supply by allowing a public entity that captures stormwater before the water reaches a natural channel to actually use that water. The author, who also chairs the Assembly's Select Committee on Water Consumption and Alternative Sources, is hoping that this clarification, coupled with the $200 million allocated for such activities under Proposition 1, will incentivize local agencies to implement more stormwater projects in the future. As the Council will recall, stormwater capture is highlighted in the Delta Plan as one mechanism that could play a key role in reducing the reliance on the Delta, as well as achieving the statewide 20 by 2020 goal, which seeks to reduce urban water use by 20%, obviously by 2020. The bill passed off the Assembly floor earlier this week and currently awaits a committee assignment in the Senate. Turning to the two water marketing bills that I've been discussing with you in the recent months, both of which were just amended last week. AB 1755 by Assemblymember Dodd is a bill that is primarily focused on data and looks to integrate water and ecosystem information through a single portal. Recent amendments to the bill, which appear to address previous concerns raised by some of the water agencies, include replacing the oversight of the portal from a proposed public benefit corporation to a consortium of DWR, the State Board, and Fish and Wildlife, as well as eliminating the proposed water transfer clearinghouse that was originally intended to serve as a virtual marketplace for those seeking transfers. Sponsored by the Bay Area Council and supported by groups such as the Water Foundation and the Nature Conservancy, the bill is currently on suspense in Assembly Appropriations due to its fiscal estimate and will be taken up tomorrow by the committee. And then the second bill is AB 2304 by Assemblymember Levee, which is now more focused on assessing the current water transfer structure and improving or simplifying the process where possible. Recent amendments include the proposed creation of a water transfer czar and a task force that would be overseen by the Natural Resources Agency, and this task force would be required to develop a series of recommendations generally aimed at improving transparency and market accessibility for willing buyers and sellers. Sponsored by the Environmental Defense Fund, AB 2304 is also currently on suspense in the Assembly and will be considered tomorrow as well. Turning to budget news, on May the 13th, Governor Brown released his revised budget, which shows a nearly $2 billion reduction in proposed spending by comparison to the January 10 budget proposal, due in large part to weaker than expected income and sales tax revenue. While the Council's budget remains unchanged, the revised proposal includes increased funding for updating local water shortage contingency plans and a permanent urban water use efficiency data tracking system, as well as $4.2 million to accelerate habitat improvement and reduce stressors for Delta smelt. The legislature will continue to hold budget hearings in the next few weeks, with the constitutionally mandated June 15th deadline approaching. Moving on to federal news, there are two items of note. The first relates to Senator Feinstein's drought legislation, which the Senate Subcommittee on Water and Power received testimony on earlier this month. Among those offering their support for the measure was Aqua, who surmised that the bill could add an additional 1.4 million acre-feet to the state's water supply, as well as the Bureau of Reclamation, who noted that the bill is a measured approach that balances the water supply and ecosystem variables. That said, the bill is not without its detractors. Earlier this month, in a letter to the senator, the federally designated Pacific Fishery Management Council expressed their concern that the bill would cause irreparable harm, particularly to the Delta's fish populations. As the council may recall, Senator Feinstein's S-2533 offers a mix of long-term and short-term remedies. The long-term provisions seek to enhance the state's water supply portfolio primarily through a $1.3 billion authorization, while the short-term aspects of the bill aim to maximize water supply predominantly through operational adjustments. Going forward, Senator Feinstein is seeking to include her bill as a component of the Senate's Western States Drought Package. Meanwhile, the House has attached provisions from Congressman Valadeo's drought measure, H.R. 2898, which among other things includes mandated pumping levels south of the Delta, to two other House bills, a must-pass energy and water appropriations bill, as well as a broader energy policy bill that the House passed just yesterday. With the appropriations measure also expected to pass out of the Republican-controlled House, the two houses will ultimately have to reconcile their differences prior to sending either bill to the president, since neither of the Senate versions of these bills include this drought language. And then the second item I'd like to highlight is an update on the Westland Settlement Agreement. As the council may recall, in September of last year, federal officials came to an agreement with the Westlands Water District that relieves the federal government of its obligation to provide drainage for land within the water district while forgiving the debt Westlands owes to the Department of Interior for the construction of the Central Valley Project. The agreement requires congressional authorization by January of next year, which is the aim of Congressman Valadeo's H.R. 4366, as well as Congressman Jim Costa's H.R. 5217. Given the political climate, the outcome of either bill is certainly not guaranteed. However, should the agreement not be authorized before January of the upcoming year, both parties can agree to an extension. And then finally, with the June primary a little more than a week away, I thought it'd be worthwhile to highlight a unique regional initiative that will be on the ballot in 9 Bay Area counties, including Solano, Contra Costa, and San Francisco. Measure AA would impose a $12 per year parcel tax to restore tidal marshes and reduce flood risk in the jurisdiction of the San Francisco Bay Area Restoration Authority as a way to address rising seas in the coming decades. The activities that would be funded operate under the notion that marshes, acting as sponges, serve as an effective buffer to absorb and slow down wave action, thereby improving flood resiliency in the region, while providing the associated benefits that would come with further restoring portions of the bay ecosystem. Expected to raise approximately $500 million over the next 20 years that the tax would be levied. The measure will need to meet a 2/3 vote threshold by the voters of the 9 counties in order to go into effect. And with that, Mr. Chairman, that concludes my report. Happy to answer any questions.
Good report, Ryan. Any questions of Ryan? Very well, thank you.
Thank you very much. And now I'd like to call up Bethany Payne, who will be providing our legal update.
Thank you. Good morning, Chair Fiorini and members. I have a very happy update to give you today, an introduction and a reintroduction. To my right, you may remember, I'll do our reintroduction first, is Ms. Caroline Soto, who bid us a fond farewell late last year to go prepare for her studies for the bar. She's since taken the bar exam, gone on a multi-continent post-bar exam trip, pass the bar exam, and then come back to us while she's waiting to be sworn into the California bar and conduct her job search. But we're very fortunate that she wanted to come back and help fulfill our mission while we before someone else gobbles her up from us. So we'd like to reintroduce her to you. She'll be giving you a legal update on one of the cases we updated you on last month, the San Joaquin County CEQA dispute between some certain counties in San Joaquin County, Contra Costa County, and Metropolitan Water Agency over the purchase of 5 South Delta islands. To my left is our new summer intern this summer, Rebecca Mills. She comes to us from McGeorge School of Law here in Sacramento with an undergraduate background in restoration ecology and a concentration at McGeorge Law School in environmental law, and also pursuing an LLM in water law. So we're very excited to have her. We had to steal her from some other competitive offers, and excited we got to scoop her up. Events, as well as Chris and I, have conspired to give them a very exciting summer here at the council. I think they're going to have a very fulfilling experience here with a lot of diverse work, and really looking forward to showing you what they're capable of doing. Rebecca will be giving you her first assignment here after being here for a day and a half, a legal update on another case we tracked for you last month, the NRDC case, water quality case brought in San Francisco against US EPA. So we'll start with Caroline's update first.
Okay, thank you. So good morning, Chair Fiorini and council members. So following up on the case that Bethany reported last month, on April 14th, San Joaquin and Contra Costa counties sued to keep the Metropolitan Water District from completing its $175 million purchase of 5 islands in the South Delta. And in their petition, the counties sought both a temporary restraining order and a preliminary injunction to stop the sale pending environmental review. And on April 29th, Judge Barbara Cronland declined to grant the temporary restraining order, and after hearing oral arguments from both parties, Judge Cronland also denied the preliminary injunction on May 19th, and the judge found that there was no defined project to implement CEQA review at this time. And Metropolitan Water District's Senior Deputy General Counsel indicated in press reports that the water agency will conduct the required environmental studies once specific plans for the islands are known. And escrow on the sale is expected to close on June 8th of this year, and we will continue to monitor the case and report back. Did you have any questions regarding this case?
Any questions of Caroline? No, and congratulations on passing the bar.
Thank you.
Okay, Rebecca.
Great. Good morning, Chair Fiorini and council members. You may recall from last month's update that the Natural Resources Defense Council, the Bay Institute, and Defenders of Wildlife filed suit against the Environmental Protection Agency. Plaintiffs allege that temporary urgency change orders issued by the State Water Board between 2014 and 15 have had the effect of amending water quality standards in the Bay Delta and Central Valley. Plaintiffs also claim that the EPA's failure to review these temporary change petitions is a violation of its oversight role under the Clean Water Act, which requires that the EPA review and approve changes to state water quality standards. On May 4th, San Luis Delta Mendota Water Authority and Westlands Water District moved to intervene in the case. The interveners have stated an interest in the preservation of the Bureau of Reclamation's ability to obtain these temporary change orders from the State Water Board and on behalf of the water right holders they represent. More specifically, that the relief sought by plaintiffs would delay, impede, or eliminate Reclamation's ability to obtain temporary change orders when needed. A hearing on the motion to intervene has been set for July 7th. Additionally, the EPA and intervening parties have opposed the case being heard before a federal magistrate judge. Subsequently, the case has been reassigned to Judge John Tiger in the San Francisco Federal District Court. The initial case management conference is scheduled for August 3rd, and we will continue to monitor the developments in this case and report back as warranted. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. Questions? No? Good reports.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bethany.
Okay. So remaining in my report is just a preview of today's agenda, which there are two major items. One is us asking your approval of a contract to support our continuing work on high-priority Delta Plan amendments. And the second is an update on our Delta Levee investment strategy, in which you'll receive a presentation on known risk to state assets. And so with that, I conclude my executive officer's report.
Thank you, Jessica. Any requests for public comment? Okay. Then we shall move on to, excuse me, file item 8, lead scientist report, Dr. Cliff Dahm. Award-winning Dr. Cliff Dahm.
Thank you, Chair Fiorini. Welcome, Ken. I've got 8 items I'd like to cover briefly in my lead scientist report. 3 of them have to do with some collaborative science activities that have either been recently finished or upcoming, and also have a few science communication items I'd like to share with you. We'll start with the review, the independent scientific peer review of the analytical approaches of the California water fix that was requested by the 3 fish agencies, the National Marine Fisheries Service, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and the California Department of Fish and Wildlife has been completed. The independent peer review panel has finished their report, and their report has recently been posted on the website that's noted in your briefing book. I also wanted to highlight a couple things relative to the meeting of the Society for Freshwater Sciences, this is the last day of the meeting. It's finishing today. It's the 21st to the 26th of May. It's held in Sacramento at the Convention Center. This is the 64th meeting of this society. This is the first meeting of this society ever in California. They had a record attendance, they had a record number of papers, and they had a record number of posters, and so it was very well attended. It's a very, the society over the years has grown to be quite international. I think about a quarter of the attendees were from outside of North America, and basically the kinds of things that were discussed at the meeting really had to do with freshwater sciences in all of its many facets, but a particular focus on streams and rivers, where a large number of the people in this society tend to focus their attention. A couple things. They had 4 plenary addresses, one each day during the time when they were having oral and poster sessions, which was Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. 3 of the presenters were from California, I think purposefully so. The 3 Californians that were asked to speak are Mary Power, National Academy of Science member at the University of California, Berkeley, spoke on her long-term research that's been done mostly on streams and rivers, actually in coastal California, in the northern part of California. Second speaker was Peter Moyle, University of California, Davis, fisheries ecologist and biologist, certainly talking about the full suite of fishes in California and the large number of endemic fishes because of our rather unique geological and climatological conditions that we find here. The third speaker was Peter Glick from the Pacific Institute. And so those were the 3 Californians, and then actually the talk yesterday, the one I was actually going to spend just a bit of time on, was actually one given by Angus Webb from the University of Melbourne. Angus Webb, I thought, gave a very nice presentation that started out to give us some background on the millennial drought in Australia, and then moved into how that ongoing and developing drought affected a lot of the science policy issues that they had to address. And one of his take-home messages, and I thought made nicely, was how the drought has institutionalized within both the agricultural industry and within the urban areas within Australia many of the water savings that were necessary to sustain the agricultural sector and to keep the cities basically from almost literally running out of water during that millennial drought. The millennial drought broke, and they had 3 years of reasonably good water availability, but now they've gone into a 3-year period where they're now returning to drought conditions, and so a lot of this I think learning from the millennial drought and instituting a lot of the changes that they did is actually helping them deal with some of the emerging drought problems that they have now, with drought conditions being, again, pretty severe for the last 3 years. So I'm going to try to chase down Angus's presentation. I talked to him after the meeting. I think he'll send it to me, and any of you who are interested, I'd be happy to share it with you.
Cliff, if you don't mind, I think it would be nice to recognize that one of the members of our Independent Science Board, Dr. Vince Resch, was also, he also received an award and recognition at this conference as well.
Yeah, I was going to finish with that. Vince Resch is one of the Independent Science Board members. He's been on the Independent Science Board since it was first constituted back in 2010. He is, I think, sort of retiring from the University of California at Berkeley, where he's had a very distinguished career. And they had a wonderful session, all-day session yesterday, where many of his colleagues and former students basically provided scientific summaries of some of the key things that Vince has accomplished over his career. I'll share one little anecdote that might entertain you. They had one of his former students, who I know very well, Gary Lamberti, who's a faculty member at Notre Dame, showed a figure of Vince's productivity, and he's prolific. He has published immensely over his career. But there were a number of peaks and valleys, and he had about 7 valleys where he might have only had 1 or 2 or 3 publications in the year. And so Gary was asking, well, why did that happen? And it turned out that Vince likes to go on sabbatical, and he went on 7 sabbaticals, and all of those sabbaticals were when his production dropped. So I thought that was entertaining. Anyway, very nice recognition for him and for his accomplishments, and yeah, it's excellent session. I also wanted to highlight that we hosted back in January a 3-day technical workshop on trying to pull together people working on the issue of mercury in the Delta. And that technical 3-day session is now going to be followed up with a synthesis effort on June the 2nd, where we're going to pull together some of the key people to try to pull together what we have learned over that period of time, and to, I think, put together a review article, try to get it published in a peer-reviewed journal. And also, this is part of some of the high-impact science actions that have been called for through the Delta Plan Interagency Implementation Committee, and this is one of the ways that we're trying to move forward on some of the things that the greater Delta community has agreed is an important science topic that needs to be synthesized and brought to a more current state of the knowledge. And so we will have that synthesis workshop on June the 3rd. It's coming up, and we'll then follow it up with the effort to pull together all of that synthesized information into a publication. So that's. So I want to go into a few science communication issues. The first one, we used the fact that we had all of these people here in Sacramento, so that we strong-armed one of our colleagues from South Florida, Nick Amon, whose position is. His role is the Regional Science Advisor for the United States Geological Survey for South Florida. He's particularly involved in Everglades restoration activities, and he gave a seminar here on Tuesday at noontime. I think interesting seminar, very much covered some of the challenges that are going on in restoration in Everglades. Also, I think gave us a nice update on how they've gone through the process of actually getting the stakeholders and the agencies engaged to make decisions on what was the highest priority restoration efforts that needs to move forward, and they're now embarking on a part of the overall restoration plan, a $2 billion component that I think after a year and a half of very intense meetings and public gatherings, they've come to a consensus agreement that this is the highest priority effort that they need to move forward on. And so he gave us, I think, some interesting information on how to bring disparate parties with different views of what is high priority into a consensus view that can get the endorsement and support. And the support comes both through federal appropriations and also from matching money from the South Florida Water Management District. So, and as Jessica Law already mentioned to you, when we have our science enterprise workshop that we're planning for late October. Nick is going to be one of those participants representing the South Florida example. So it's nice to have him here and nice to give a presentation. And I think, I know the chair and the executive officer both got an opportunity to hear Nick's presentation. I also, for Ken's information, I also pick a paper that I think is of high importance and that is current and recent to present to the council. And the one I picked this time is one that I picked both because I thought it was just a very fascinating and interesting paper with global implications, also California implications. But the other reason I picked it is that I knew that the lead author was going to be here at the meeting. And in fact, he gave a talk on this paper, and I had a chance to sit down and chat with him at length about the paper. So the paper I'm going to highlight to you is a paper that just came out in the journal Bioscience. And the title is Flow Management for Hydropower Extirpates Aquatic Insects Undermining River Food Webs. This is a study that is, as I mentioned to the Independent Science Board, has a lot of interesting elements of what we here on the council need to consider when we talk about some of best available science and when we also consider some of the input that we're getting from our Delta Independent Science Board. So this paper focuses on flows and fishes and aquatic invertebrates. It has got a very strong modeling component. It has citizen science that was instrumental in making this happen. And basically what this paper did was, this is part of the group that is charged with basically management and the science support of management in the Colorado Grand Canyon region, the area downstream of the Glen Canyon Dam. The Glen Canyon Dam, along with Lake Mead, is operated for hydropower generation, and the hydropower generation that is done in both the Glen Canyon system uses a hydropeaking technique where they basically increase the discharge to generate more electricity during the daytime, and then they reduce the flows and generate less electricity during the nighttime. And this has been a long time operational component of the dam. Well, this group working in the Grand Canyon used all the river rafters that go down the Grand Canyon to actually begin to collect the adult stage of the aquatic insects that were found in the canyon. And they found that the fauna in the canyon was extremely depauperate from what you would expect in a river of that type. About a quarter of the species that you would normally expect of these aquatic insects were being found. And so they were interested in why that was happening, and so they did some research where it turns out that a number of the what would normally be the dominant fauna in these kind of systems would be things like stoneflies and mayflies and caddisflies, things that the fly fishermen would know well if any of you happened to be fishing. They were not there. They just simply didn't exist. And there were quite a few other aquatic invertebrates that were just missing. They were in the tribs that come into the canyon, but they weren't in the river itself. And so what they ultimately found out is that all of these aquatic insects have a life history stage where, as adults, they go into the edges of the water and they lay their eggs, and they cement their eggs to a hard surface, and then the eggs basically hatch. Well, it turned out that they were, in many cases, doing the egg laying over multiple years when the water was during the hydropeaking period, when there was much higher, about 1.5 meters higher water than there would be during the low stage. And so what was happening is that they would lay their eggs, and then 12 hours later the water levels would drop and these eggs would be stranded. They would be out of the water, and so produced mortality in the eggs, and they basically have lost that fauna. So the paper goes into the evidence. They modeled the process as it moved through the canyon, And they also had some very interesting recommendations, and this was the part that was not actually in the written paper that I got to find out from Ted Kennedy, and that is, in the paper, they suggested that one way they might be able to ameliorate this problem is hydropeaking is really not necessary on the weekend. So one of the things that might help the situation is simply hydropeak during the weekdays, but not hydropeak on the weekends. But there's also a critical period of time where a lot of these organisms that are missing would likely be laying their eggs. There's a window of about 4 to 6 weeks that's kind of in the late spring, early summer. So the other suggestion is that they cease hydropeaking during that small window. The cost that's going to occur relative to the hydropower lost is only about a 1% of annual revenue. So it's not a huge amount of resource. So it sounds like that's actually going to be done as an adaptive management experiment. So they're going to try this, see if this actually brings back some of these missing species. And this is a system which has some analogs to here in the Delta, where we are concerned that some of our native fish species basically don't have adequate food resources. And so this is going to be, and the same thing's happening for a number of endangered fish that are in the Colorado River system. So this is going to be an experiment which I think be worth following. I thought the way that they went around doing the detective story to figure this out, and also to come up with some constructive ideas on maybe how to ameliorate this, makes this to be an interesting paper. And I think it's germane for paper where germane for dams anywhere in the world where hydropeaking is used, particularly in constrained systems where basically what you're producing is a tidal system in a river. And a lot of these insects are not used to a tidal type system, and so many of them, their life histories are just not amenable to this. So interesting paper. Any of you interested in the paper itself, I'll be happy to share it, but I thought that was to me, it was one of the more exciting papers I've read recently. So, I also wanted to highlight that the latest issue of our journal, the San Francisco Estuary and Watershed Sciences, has a paper that I think was got some useful management implications, and that is basically a paper looking at where within the Delta is Egeria more likely to establish. So Brazilian waterweed is certainly a significant problem within the Delta. They've basically done some advanced hydrodynamic modeling involving some of the UC Davis scientists and some of the Dutch scientists that were collaborative on this effort. They basically are looking at some of the key factors on establishment of Egeria. The things that are particularly important are turbidity, depth, and how strong the current is. And so with this, they've mapped a number of these areas, and one of the take-home messages in this paper is that this kind of information probably needs to be fed into restoration projects going forward, because some of these restoration projects will be creating habitat in some of these situations where conditions of turbidity, current, and depth might be conducive for the Egeria. So basically a kind of a cautionary note that they note in this paper. I also highlighted, there's a poster out in the hall if you'd like to take a look at it. We picked a poster that has to do with mercury, since the Mercury Symposium is about to occur. It's a paper basically updating information on mercury levels in fish in the Delta. And the main, I think, thrust of the poster is actually to basically try to get information out using the Sacramento San Joaquin Delta Conservancy, the California Department of Public Health, and the Central Valley Regional Water Quality Control Board to get this information to some of the groups of people that use the Delta as a fish resource and who fish and will consume significant amounts of those fish, trying to get information on, what are safe levels to eat and what are the levels that the various fish have. So yeah, that's the poster out there for your viewing. And then I want to end by introducing Lauren Umani, taking over from Daniel Livesey, who used to give you the by the numbers report. This is Lauren's first time to give this report. Lauren also was very instrumental in putting together the lead scientist report, and I want to thank her for her efforts, and I would let her give you an update on where we are relative to water supplies and some of the fish metrics. Lauren.
Thank you, Cliff. Good morning to...
Turn your mic on.
Welcome.
All right, thank you. Thanks to Cliff. Good morning to Chair Fiorini and the council members. So I just wanted to start off by talking about the precipitation levels this past month. So for rainfall, it continues to be good this month. The Northern Sierra received an additional 2 inches of rain since the last month. And similarly, Central Sierra received almost an additional inch of rain, such that it's now at 105% of its average to date. Okay, so snowpack. Last month, Daniel talked a little bit about how snowpack is decreasing quite a bit, and that trend continues. So it's been melting quite rapidly. In the Northern Sierra, snowpack has decreased by 11 inches, so it's now at 29% of the average to date. In the Central Sierra, snowpack has also declined by about 12 inches, so it's now at 35% of its average to date, and that's down from 68% of its average to date last month. Statewide, snowpack has declined 11 inches, and so now it's also at 28% of its average. So reservoir storage, not too many changes from last month. A couple of minor decreases in the Shasta average. These are still quite high, so the ratings are good, but it decreased by 1% since last month. Of its average to date. Oroville also decreased by 7% this past month. And the water in San Luis Reservoir has dropped by 8% this last month. So the water supply for San Luis has decreased from a poor rating to now a bad rating. In terms of water quality and flow, inflow for the Sacramento River at Freeport is still poor, but it has increased a little bit by 1,200 CFS to 63% of its 20-year May flow average. Inflow for San Joaquin at Vernalis is also still bad. It dropped almost 1,200 CFS since the last month. So now it's at 16% of its 20-year May flow average. So that's not doing too well. In contrast, although the pumping rate at Clifton, Court 4 Bay, and Jones remained the same in terms of its rate since last month, the exports are now actually good because now it's at 107% of its average for May. So in all three cases, salinity remains good. Okay, and then so we thought that it was important for the council to know about a metric called the water year type classification system that DWR puts out every May. This describes the upcoming water year, and it runs from October 1st to September 30th for each water year. And we wanted to highlight this metric and classification because it determines the delta outflow standards for the rest of the year. So this is a pretty important metric. So for the Sacramento Valley, the value was 7.1, which is considered below normal. And this classification system runs on a scale from wet all the way down to critically dry. So for Sacramento Valley this year, the forecast is below normal. For the San Joaquin Valley, the metric was at 2.5, and these indicate runoff. And so this classifies the San Joaquin Valley as dry for the water year classification. So even though we've had a bunch of precipitation this year and the reservoirs are pretty full, these are still at below normal levels, partially because this calculation includes last year's runoff, which, as we all know, was very low. Okay, so finally onto the fish numbers. This time we're looking at Delta smelt, and last month Daniel highlighted the spring Kodiak trawl total catch, which is a measure of the number of adults in the system. Once again, it's quite bad. An additional 27 adults were caught this month, bringing the January to May cumulative catch up to 60, but that still pales in comparison to the average for year-to-date, which is 503. We also wanted to highlight the 20-millimeter survey, which is, it captures juveniles in the system. And this can be an indication of next year's spawning cohort. And so we wanted to see if the increased precipitation would be evident in the number of juveniles, which would then cascade to the number of adults potentially in the following year. And so 27 juveniles were, well, I guess we didn't highlight this last month, but 27 juveniles were caught this month, raising the January to May total to 92 juveniles, but this also, this is slightly better than last year, which was at 73. So you can see that the current round of precipitation did help a little bit, but this is still the fourth worst number on record, and the average for the January to May time period is 469 smelt. So with that, I will take any questions.
Thank you, Lauren. Questions of Lauren? No, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Cliff?
That concludes the lead scientist report. I'd be happy to address any questions that you might have.
Questions of Cliff? Yes, Ken.
That was very interesting, all of that. Curious about the paper. And then, you know, was there the tension between greenhouse gas reduction if you take the withdrawals out of Powell offline, if you just shut it down, you know, they're replacing it with something else, and you know, if that's fossil fuel based, then you're going to get into that back and forth. And maybe the other comment or question is, did they find that, I think you mentioned it, the adaptive management that the Bureau of Reclamation has been conducting out of Powell to send sediment down the river, did that also have an adverse impact, or was that really background noise compared to the hydro peaking?
I'll address the second part of your question first. The sediment appears not to affect these organisms too negatively. They do cement their eggs down well. It's the drying, desiccation is really the key to this. Yet they are very linked to the adaptive management program that is being run within the Grand Canyon. This is actually part of the U.S. Geological Survey's Grand Canyon Adaptive Management Team. They start the article actually with a nice discussion of the importance of hydropower as a non-greenhouse gas generating component of our energy portfolio. 19% worldwide now is hydroelectric, and in California it's about 6 to 12% depending on the year. And so it is a very important part. So I think that's one of the reasons why, in talking to Ted and also in the end of the paper, they really outlined some methods that they think moving forward would allow them to continue to have the comparable amount of generation, minor, very, very minor changes in actual yield, but they do want to do it experimentally. So they're going to try this weekend cessation of hydropeaking, and then they're going to try this short window of time where they basically generate steady amounts of electricity rather than do the peaking at the daytime and the reduction at night. So, and it sounds like they've moved pretty far in actually getting agreements to do this and do it as an experimental protocol, so it can be used then as in an adaptive management. The other thing he shared with me is that they think there is adequate within the system there is adequate sources of recruitment to get these organisms back if they go through this. But he did say that there is possibility they might actually have to bring the organisms physically to the system and actually reintroduce them. And so they'll probably look at both options and start initially with the passive, and then potentially, if that doesn't work, take a more active stance. But
it's encouraging that they want to work on this because they're economically incentivized to sell that power during the peak, and recognizing that they should do less. That's pretty positive.
The other question I ask, and I don't really have a good answer for it, but it's interesting. I mean, one of the reasons for the hydro-peaking is the disparate demand during different times of the day. But we're also building and putting online a lot of solar power here in the southern part of California, and it also peaks in the day. So is there an alternative to basically use that solar generated and reduce our need for hydro-peaking? And I don't know if that's an option or not, but anyway, we had a nice discussion, but didn't come to any conclusions.
Okay, anything else? Cliff, thank you very much. And again, congratulations on your award. Any requests for comment? None? All right, council members, we're at a decision point. We have 2 more agenda items. We can forge ahead or we can break for lunch. What is your pleasure?
You're the chair.
Frank? Hungry? Well, it looks like we're staffed up for the next 2 agenda items, so I'm going to decide to move forward. So we will proceed to file item number 9, approval for executive officer to enter into a contract for services to assist the council in amending the Delta Plan.
Okay, thank you. Well, for about 12 months, you've been hearing about and contributing to progress towards a Delta Plan amendment on conveyance, storage, and the operations of both to meet the co-equal goals. Another high-priority Delta Plan amendment will be an update of our ecosystem chapter. So with your approval, this consultant contract could also assist us in other priority Delta Plan amendments, including our levee investment strategy in part, or other items that are identified in the next few years or during our required 5-year review of the Delta Plan. So this is an important step in completing the work that we've committed to, and with that, we've got staff up at the table who can walk you through the details.
This is an action item, so at the conclusion of the presentation and questions, we'll ask for public comment and then proceed.
Okay, good morning. Well, maybe it's not morning. Chair Fiorini and council members. As Jessica mentioned, this is related to a contract for MWH. And so just to give you a little background, in 2010, the council approved a contract with CH2M Hill to support development of the Delta Plan. CH provided program management, technical, and environmental services on behalf of and under the direction of the council. They provided expertise in several areas, including CEQA compliance, water supply planning, water quality, public outreach, and technical support for Administrative Procedures Act rulemaking. That existing contract is soon expiring. As you know, the council is committed to several Delta Plan amendments on the following high-priority topics: conveyance, storage, and operations, ecosystem restoration, and Delta Levees investment strategy. The council has made some progress in these areas. As you know, in November of 2015, the council adopted the 19 principles for water conveyance in the Delta, for storage systems, and for the operation of both to achieve the co-equal goals. And in March 2016, the council endorsed a 3-step process for development of the conveyance, storage, and operations amendment. However, additional work is needed in developing plan amendments. Using the request for consulting services process, which Lita will describe next, the consulting firm MWH Americas Incorporated was selected to support the council and council staff with development of the upcoming plan amendments. Services covered in the contract would include development of the draft amendments, preparation of appropriate CEQA documentation,
and documentation necessary for APA rulemaking. I'll now turn over the discussion to Lita Bridey from our Planning Division, who has been leading this contracting process. She will briefly step through the solicitation process used to select the consultant.
Thank you, Cassandra, for the introduction. On January 26th, the Council opened a solicitation for the Delta Plan Amendment work. We received the final submittal packets on March 18th. A selected team of Council staff evaluated the submittals with a ranking process and negotiated consultant rates. The amounts charged are comparable to other services received by the Council. On April 26th, the staff announced the recommendation to award the contract to MWH Americas Inc. And MWH was the highest ranked qualifying firm, and we are confident they will provide a wide breadth of expertise, and they demonstrated the understanding of the Council staff and needs. MWH brings a team of renowned subcontractors. ESA has a skilled team of environmental scientists who will address the needs of the Ecosystem Restoration Amendment anticipated next year. Kearns & West brings expertise in public relations to support our work, and Accent Environmental specializes in CEQA and will aid in performing environmental analysis needed to support our amendments work. The request before you today is to authorize the executive officer to execute the 3-year, $2.45 million contract with MWH Americas Inc. to assist the Council in the development of multiple Delta Plan amendments. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions of staff? Mary.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think this is important work. I just had a quick question, a couple questions on process. Out of curiosity, is MWH an acronym or is that the name of the business?
It's the name of the business.
Okay, so it doesn't stand for anything. I keep trying to make it stand for something.
It used to stand for, maybe it still does, Montgomery, Watson, Harzo, which I think were the principals of the firms that merged to create the modern MWH.
But now it's just MWH. Okay, I'll have to get used to that.
To complicate it further, actually, now it's MWH/Stantec, because I believe MWH was recently acquired by a Canadian firm.
Okay, thank you. Was there a scope of work proposed by MWH as part of this proposal? And if so, I'm curious if there's a copy available. There wasn't one on my agenda packet. If we could have access to the scope of work.
Yes, there was a scope of work that was developed, and we can provide a copy.
That'd be great. And then I'm going to assume, maybe Dan wants to answer this, that measurables or milestones that are associated with the work product are part of the contract.
We used the request for consulting services, which was primarily focused on the skill sets that were being brought. We'll do detailed scopes of work for individual components on a task order basis, and those will be drafted beginning with the conveyance, storage, and operations one as soon as we get a contract signed. So that's really when we'll have complete scopes of work and milestones available.
Okay. And then I'm going to hope or seek that on the regulatory policies indicated on page 2, third paragraph down, and performance measures, that we would include water quality policies as part of the information seeking and analysis.
Well, I think we'll be, there's a couple of different ways that could occur. One is through the Ecosystem Restoration Amendment. I think we would be revisiting the water quality policies. That could be an element of that to see if we're satisfied with the ones we have now or whether we need to adjust them. And if we did, then that would include performance measures. And then, of course, we're in the process of sorting through the performance measures. You know, you approved an amendment a couple of months ago to deal with those, and we're looking at those, again, to assure ourselves about their adequacy.
Okay, so I'll have to track that.
Yeah.
Those were my questions, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Good. Any other questions? Yes, Ken?
Chair, I'm going to have to recuse myself from this item and ask the clerk to record me as did not vote. I do have a subcontractor relationship with MWH on a project in San Diego.
Very good. Thank you for that. Do we have any public comment? Okay. We do have public comment. Lita will happy to take it, or Pat? OSHA, please introduce yourself and proceed.
Good afternoon, and I won't take you long from your lunch. I'm here on behalf of local agencies of the North Delta. We obviously are following this item with great interest. While the council has been moving forward on certain of these initiatives on its own, it also relates quite directly to the court ruling we received last week. I believe the scope of this work will probably enlarge and clarify quite a bit based on that 75-page ruling. In particular, the need for quantifiable and measurable targets to implement all the objectives of the Delta Plan, I think will take quite a bit of work. The court has also given guidance on the need to develop conveyance policies, and just I would clarify with the staff report that that is irrespective of the status of BDCP. And with all due respect, I do have a concern in reading the staff report this week to see that the former chief environmental management person from DWR is now heading up the council's process to update its plans and policies. And I certainly respect Ms. Cassandra Enos quite a bit, and I've worked with her in her role at DWR over the years with respect to the BDCP and then the California Water Fix. But I do have a big concern that if somebody coming directly over from DWR is now heading up the council's process, whether it has to do with the metrics or the development of the conveyance policies, it signals to me as a member of the public and representing affected landowners and agencies within the Delta that are most impacted by this project that now somebody within DWR is now perhaps helping guide that process so that specifically the tunnels will be consistent with whatever the council may do. Now, so I just bring that up so that I think you probably already understand that would be a sensitivity on behalf of major stakeholders in this process. And I bring it up just to air that concern, and I hope that it's just a concern that is not grounded in anything, but I will be watching the council and their development of these amendments quite carefully to make sure that it's true to the council's overall mission, which is reliable water supply, ecosystem restoration, and with respect, and also respectful of the existing communities and environments within the Delta itself. Thanks.
Thank you for that. Any other comments? Very good. What's the council's pleasure on this matter? Yes.
I'll move the item as it's been presented, Mr. Chairman.
We have a motion.
I'll second.
Councilmember Brown seconds. Any discussion on the matter? We'll proceed with a vote beginning with Judge Damrell.
Brown, aye.
Fiorini, aye.
PFO, aye.
All right, motion passes 4-0. I have been, and thank you, Dan, Cassandra, Lita, for the presentation and all the work in preparation for this. I've been advised that although we have only one other item, it could be rather lengthy. So out of respect for those of you who may have hunger pains, we shall recess for, we'll adjourn for lunch period of 45 minutes. We will reconvene at 1 o'clock. Thank you. We will reconvene now after a short lunch break. My thanks to my fellow colleagues at the front table for returning on time. We're going to pick up the agenda on file item 10, which is a discussion regarding risks to Delta assets of significant state interest and an update on Delta levee investment strategy. Jessica?
Thank you. Yeah, in the interest of time, I think I'll just hand it directly over to our capable staff and consultants to start the item.
Okay. Thank you. Good afternoon, Council. Just to give you a little bit of background here, joining me today are two members from our consulting team. We have Larry Roth and Charles Gardner that will be walking through the presentation today. Just to give you a little bit of a reminder of where we're picking up today. As you remember, last month we had a presentation from the consulting team regarding assets within the Delta and Sassoon Marsh and how they relate to the state's interests. We had maps that were presented where those assets were and how they were being quantified. Today we're going to go into a little deeper discussion and take those assets, building on that discussion, and how are we evaluating risk to those state interests that we have identified. So I'll lead that into the presentation. Just as one note of item in case I forget at the end of the presentation, I do want to mention that we have 2 public workshops coming up next month. The first one will be June 6th in Brentwood, and the second one will be June 9th in West Sacramento. And the focus of those public workshops will be to work with local stakeholders and technical experts within the region and walk through these presentation items with them as well and receive feedback. So in case I don't think of it at the end, I just want to make sure we got that in there. With that, I'll turn it over to Larry and Charles for the presentation.
Thank you, Dustin. Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and members of the council. I want to thank you for the opportunity to be here today. Could we have the screen, please? I want to talk to you today about risk, but let me preface it by reminding you that William Hammond Hall, who was the first state engineer for California, is famously credited with saying that there are 2 types of levees, those that have been overtopped and those that will be overtopped. And with that as the context, our challenge is to use that information effectively in prioritizing levee investments in the California Delta. In the past, and yet today, the normal process has been to use or to apply level of protection methodology. You'd be familiar with level of protection methodology and the characterization of flood at 1 in 100 year level of protection, perhaps 1 in 200 year level of protection, which is going to be used for California urban areas, and perhaps even 1 in 50 year levels of protection. But in the level of protection methodology, the focus is on the probability of failure, and it does not include in its analysis the second half of the risk equation that you see on the screen before you, and that's consequences to assets. And it's inescapable that if there are consequences from flooding, then risks are very real. So we have adopted a risk-based approach. You were actually instructed to do so in the Delta Plan, to use a risk-informed analysis. And the major advantages of the risk-based approach is that if we know risks on an island-by-island basis, then we can compare risks across islands, across Delta, and identify priority islands for further consideration. And we can go an additional step in being able to measure the cost effectiveness of proposals to reduce that risk, whether they're structural proposals such as levee improvements or non-structural proposals, which may include factors such as improved evacuation. So today's discussion is based on this very simple equation with some complexity in its application, but we're looking at risk, which is the probability of flooding times consequences to assets. And I might just indicate to you that this, even though when applied to flood risk, it may not be a common way of thinking or discussing this particular topic, but each of us is familiar with making risk decisions every day. We decide what our insurance deductibles should be for our home or for our automobiles. We decide whether to risk a ticket and fail to fasten our seatbelt, or we accept the risk of being in an accident and not wearing our seatbelts, or we choose or choose not to buy a product liability protection or product guarantees such as Apple Care. These are risk decisions that we make every day. These are the same kind of risk decisions that can be made when it comes to flood risk in the Delta.
So I want to talk a little bit more about what this risk information means and how we talk about it. As Larry said, it is an accepted method for understanding the consequences of highly variable or uncertain events. The typical language of the risk results is an expected annual consequence, expected annual fatalities, expected annual damages, loss of habitat, et cetera. And we'll go through those in a few minutes. The expected annual really describes what could happen over the course of many years, considering various hazards like floods and earthquakes, and considering a full range of the severity of those events, a 10-year flood, a 100-year flood, a 500-year earthquake, et cetera. And the expected annual information is, in many cases, quantified, but it doesn't necessarily mean that every year we could expect to see that consequence. It means, on average, over a long period of time, those are the consequences that are likely to occur. But it is a way of in essence, analyzing those uncertainties. Another key point is that, as with your investment portfolio, past results are no guarantee of future performance. So that the historical record is informative but isn't necessarily predictive. And so with that as a little bit of caveat, I want to kind of walk through some of the risks that the Delta is facing. As Dustin said, last month we presented to you the compilation of the Delta assets in the categories that you've identified are important for state interests. The population, property in the Delta, water supply functions in the Delta, ecosystem functions in the Delta, and then additional Delta as place considerations, including legacy towns, prime agricultural land, and public roads. So in Larry's equation, those pieces are incorporated into the consequences part of this. It's hard to talk about risk without doing some math, so Larry's going to talk a little bit about some math.
I drew the short straw, I guess, and we'll talk about some mathematical equations. This one looks a little bit complicated, but it really is fairly simple and straightforward. We're talking about the probability of flooding being related to two other probabilities, one being the probability that the hazard would occur. We just talked about that with respect to floods like 1 in 100 years, 1 in 200 years is a probability that a particular flood event will occur. And we multiply that by the probability that a levee might fail when the floodwaters reach a particular elevation. This is characterized by what's known as a fragility curve. If we take the information from the levee fragility curves, the probability that a particular hazard will occur, whether it's an earthquake or a flood, then we can determine the probability of flooding. You will know or recall that with Delta Levee's investment strategy, our charge is to use exclusively existing information. And so some of the information that we're relying on has been around for a couple of years and may be open to criticism perhaps for being somewhat dated, but it's the best available information that we have. And we are confident that this characterization of the probability of flooding it gives us a very solid indication of relative risk throughout the Delta, so that using this information, which can and should be updated in the future, but using the information that's available today, we can characterize relative risk throughout the Delta, and that's what we're going to be presenting to you today.
Yeah, building on that point, I think the whole intent here is to give you a picture and literally a visual picture of where the risks are in the delta, so you can begin to consider that, and we'll be coming back with more information over the next several months. But so you can consider that as you think about what are the priorities for state investment, what should the risk reduction strategy look like going into the future. So this is some important information to inform you of that. So let's start first with the probability of flooding. This is the foundational piece of each of the different types of risks that we'll show you in a minute. So you have this map in your packet. I think it's been available on the website as well for those who are watching. This map shows the relative probability of flooding calculated for each of these islands. As Larry said, it relies on this concept of levee fragility. It also considers for each island, it uses an approach using the weakest link. So it's an estimate of the conditions of the levees there, what's the weakest point of that levee. That introduces some uncertainty because flood and tides can influence an island from different directions. But this is an estimate of the probability of flooding for each of the islands in the delta. The darker colors show the higher probabilities of flooding, lighter colors are lower probabilities of flooding. And over here on the right, you can see the ordered listing of the islands by probability of flooding, and all the islands are listed here and available. I'd highlight a couple of other things that the probability of flooding includes consideration of both hydrologic causes of levee failures as well as earthquake causes. They're summed together in this image, but just to give you a little quick sense of the difference between the two, the hydrologic causes of levee failures are generally larger or greater than the earthquake causes. You can see they're generally in the top levels are 3 to even as high as 30%. The earthquake causes, if we look at those individually or separately from hydrologic, are at a lower level, generally 3% or lower. So just so you have a sense of the relative scale of those two components, but again, the overall probability of flooding considers both causes. So let's get into, I was going to show you one other thing, and that is that the analysis also includes the ability to look forward and consider sea level rise and the implications of that using the state policy guidance on sea level rise at the Golden Gate, translated across the Delta. So if I click on that, you can see, and I'll go back and forth so you can sort of see the difference, but there is an increase in flood probability as a result of sea level rise if we look out to a high scenario in 2050.
Charles, you've spawned a question.
Sure.
Sorry, Charles, to interrupt you.
No problem.
But before you move off this slide, and you were talking about the hydrologic cause being greater than an earthquake cause, 3% or lower, but then you talked about the chart taking effect, consideration of both. And my question is, are they both being taken into consideration simultaneously or two different scenarios? Or are you looking at a flood and an earthquake in your risk ratio?
No, that's a great question. I'll leave that to Larry.
It's based on the very low probability of a high flood and an earthquake happening simultaneously. So what we do to approximate it is to add the probabilities of the both events, assuming that they're essentially discrete events. So they're added together.
Okay, thank you for the clarification.
Great.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Great.
Jen has a question too.
Sure.
Just have one question regarding the data. This takes me back to statistics, and I remember GIS and loved it, but just
Careful, you might be asked to explain the math.
Well, I'm trying to just get a better clarification of the math that was used for the values that are mapped here, and I'll use my eyes are not as good, but the annual probability of flooding levied islands as an example.
Yep.
So the values that are listed in the key range in the percentages, but are those values, I'm assuming that they represent the mean of your sample size? And if they do, are they closer to the average or the median? I'm just trying to get a clear idea of what the values of the greater than 5% represent.
Yeah, so the flood probability is calculated for each island. And so this lists them for each island. The key is basically the color key that identifies those that have greater than 5%. So all of these are in dark blue.
I understand. I'm just trying to get an idea of the concentration of those areas of probability of flooding with a greater than 5%. What is the range of those values? When we say greater than 5, it could be greater than 6, or is it greater than 20?
Yeah, so
I'm just trying to get an idea.
so on each island is listed here on the right with a probability of flooding for that island.
Okay.
And so, so for example, the probability of flooding for, let's do Grizzly Island, which is that island, is 12.8%.
Okay.
And that's calculated individually for that island based on the conditions of that levee and how an earthquake might affect those levees, or how the waters of the tides and flows and floods would.
I understand. I think the need for clarification came in our maps. We don't have the key on the right side, and so we don't have the individual data, so I wasn't able to determine that.
Right.
But thank you for the clarification.
And also, just so I understand, but others may be wondering too, a finer point, Charles, on your comment about it's all based on the weakest levee, correct? Okay.
Yeah, do you want to expand on that, Larry?
Well, the weakest link in a levee, not the weakest levee in the delta. So each, yeah, sure.
Amber alert, everything's going off.
Amber alert, okay. Okay. Yeah. So let's get into the actual specific risk maps. So the first one is life risk, or the technical term is expected annual fatalities. And so this shows, again, as you have in your map in your packet, shows the relative risk to lives in the Delta. On the list on the right shows the actual calculated expected annual fatalities. And again, this is a good example of where the number gives us some sense of the relative importance. It doesn't necessarily mean that in Maintenance Area 9, the pocket area, that 3.6 people are going to die every year for the next few years. It is a probability calculation. So it gives us some sense of the relative probability of loss of life. So that's a result here. If I look at Maintenance Area 9, a population of roughly 47,000 people and a probability of flooding of 2.8%. This also includes consideration of evacuation procedures and the vulnerability to people who live there. It is not that if there's a flood, 47,000 people would be affected. It considers evacuation procedures, et cetera.
Might just interrupt here for a moment. These first two risks, expected annual fatalities and expected annual damages, are calculated according to standard procedures that are well established by organizations like the Corps of Engineers, the Federal Emergency Management Administration, and even the Bureau of Reclamation when it comes to dams. So our approach to EAF, expected annual fatalities and expected annual damages, is consistent with the way calculations would be made by most organizations within the United States, but also internationally. When it comes to the risks that you'll see later, the ones that are Delta specific, those are the risks that we have developed based on information from the Council regarding the risk to state interests. So I just want to emphasize that EAF and EAD are very consistent with normally accepted practices throughout the United States.
So let me go to the property, risk to property. And again, you'll recall from last month that the property here we're talking about are the structures, the infrastructure, and the crops that are on the islands. And so this identifies and values the damages to those assets. It doesn't consider the assessed value of the property, for example. Some people have been asking about that. So again, this shows the relative risk to property and assets across the Delta. And in some cases, there's a high value of assets that's at risk. For example, in the Maintenance Area 9 has a value of assets that's on the order of $3.5 billion. Let me just quickly compare a couple here that are similar so you can see a little bit difference of how these work. So in Reclamation District 17, down here in the South Delta, that has an asset value of roughly $2.4 billion and a probability of flooding of 1.6%. So an expected annual damage of $12.8 million. A similar expected annual damage on Grand Island, so $11.9 million of expected annual damage. That's a result of about $340 million of assets. So a lot lower level of assets, but a higher probability of flooding, 3.8% probability of flooding. And so you'll see here on Grand Island and Reclamation District 17, they have comparable expected annual damage, but for slightly different reasons. Okay. As Larry said, those two measures of risk are pretty standard procedures, standard calculations for flood risk management. So where there are assets of other assets of state importance, the team has developed with council staff and with some expert input a variety of ways to measure risk for these other things that are important, the co-equal goals and Delta S place. So the first one is the water supply, and I'm going to show you two different ways to think about that, just because I think it's important to look at it in different ways as we proceed. But the first focuses on the users of water and the functions that the islands serve for water in the Delta. You'll recall from last month those key functions are the salinity barriers of the western Delta islands, the water conveyance functions of islands that help move fresh water across the Delta, and then the function of islands in protecting water supply infrastructure like intakes, canals, and pipelines. So we've considered all three of those, and we've considered the users that rely on those. And what's shown here is a metric of essentially adding up those user functions in the Delta. So how important is an island in the Delta for those different functions of water supply and for those different users? Sorry, I've got a little glitch here. I got to go. Sorry about that. So, for example, Holland Tract, Hotchkiss Tract are important for water supply infrastructure and conveyance for multiple users. So it's in some ways you might think of that as maybe that's a most important island. And so we've got those listed here. I can show all of them. So that shows all of the islands that are important for water supply for at least one function. And then what we're looking at here is the probability of flooding. We didn't want to multiply these two things together. We want to kind of keep them separate so you can see. We think it's simple enough to see the functions and the probabilities. But we can also then look and say, well, if we sort by the probability of flooding, we might say that Holt Station is a really important one to pay some attention to because it's got a high probability of flooding. Whereas someone else might say, well, it's really just one user, one function out there, so some of these other ones might be more important to look at. So that's one way of looking at water supply. The second one looks at water diversions from the Delta and considers what percentage of the water diversions to the Delta depend on each of these islands. So this is highlighting the ones that have the greatest dependence, but let me just scale this down a little bit. So there's sorry, I went a little too far. So there's a number of islands here in the Western Delta and the Conveyance Corridor that, not surprisingly, are highly important for both water quality and water supply. So those show up. And then there are other islands that are important but have a lower percentage of the total diversions of the Delta that rely on them. So this is just another way of displaying which islands are important for you to consider as we go forward in the future months. And again, we can look at the probability of flooding of those islands and start to link together so you'd have an understanding of where the priorities might be. Keep rolling. So now if we look at habitat, we look at ecosystem. And the metric here is based on habitat. So it's looking at the question of, well, if we have levees out there, where are those levees protecting habitat? Where is terrestrial habitat at risk if levees fail? And so this looks at the acreage of high-value habitat, high-value terrestrial habitat in essence, or high-value habitat that's protected by the levees. And again, using the probability of flooding and the acreage of that high-value habitat, we get a picture for where is high-value habitat at risk of flooding if the levees fail. And probably not surprisingly, Grizzly Island out in Suisun Marsh, that's a large area, has a large amount of habitat and levees that have a high probability of flooding. You'll remember that from the list. It's 17% or 13% probability of flooding. So, so that shows up at the top of the list. But again, you get a relative sense of where are levees important for protecting habitat and where are those risks greatest for the habitat. So now let me talk a little bit about the Delta as place considerations. You'll remember there were three considerations that we're looking at. One is legacy towns, one is prime agricultural land, and one is the public roadways. And so let me go through each of those quickly. So here we've identified the islands that have legacy towns. Again, here there isn't a way to particularly put a value on a legacy town. It is a legacy town. The Delta plan, you have identified it as it has value. So the calculation here is really just the probability of flooding. What's the probability of flooding a legacy town? And you can see that it's relatively high, almost 4% for a few, relatively low for Rio Vista. Looking at prime agricultural land, this is calculated similarly to how the ecosystem or the habitat one is calculated. It's looking at the acreage of prime ag land of statewide importance and unique agricultural land, those three categories. Taking those total acres and looking at the probability of flooding. And again, you see a range of risk, a relative range of risk for that feature of the Delta, which is so important to the local economy. And then the last one is looking at the public roadways, state and federal highways and county roads that are so important for the regional economy, the local economy, mobility in the Delta, and also for evacuation purposes. So, so this just identifies the islands that have those roadways on them, and again shows you the probability of flooding of those roadways. So you have a sense of which parts of the network are most at risk. I'm going to conclude with sort of a little teaser of where this goes in the future. As you can see, there are lots, as you know, there are lots of issues and interests in the Delta that overlap and intersect. And so ultimately, as you start to explore priorities for investment and your risk reduction strategies, you'll want to see, well, how do these risks combine or for an island? And this is a preview picture if we take all of those risks that we just walked through and show them for each island. You can see that there are islands that have multiple risks. Oops, sorry about that. Clicked on that by mistake. You can see that there are islands here that have multiple risks, and then down on the list there are some that have fewer risks. So as we come back to you in the future, we'll have more information to show you how you might consider compiling or organizing that in a way that would be informative to you as you think about priorities. And as Dustin said, our next step is to have some community meetings with stakeholders to really delve into this a little bit more with stakeholders in the community and get their input on these risks and also how they see the relative importance of these different risks, so we can bring that back to you. That's it. Happy to answer any questions or go back and show anything.
Questions for our presenters? Ken? Go ahead. Ken and then Mary?
This is my first meeting. I don't want to...
I defer.
Thank you.
It's whoever catches my eye first.
Just maybe some background questions for my edification is maybe I missed this, the years of hydrology that you used to determine the frequency. How far back did you go, and did you, is that sort of the baseline condition and your level of confidence of that as a tool to look forward?
I can't really answer that.
It's not a math question, but Larry, take it.
Yeah, I really can't answer the question about how far back does it go. We have that information in our background data, and we can get that very simply. I just don't have it with me. But I think that in general, the hydrologic regime of the Delta is really quite complex. It's got streams coming in from literally all the way around, any one of which could be in a flood condition while the other ones are not. And then that's coupled with, of course, the tidal condition. So we have in the Delta we're using a discharge recurrence as opposed to a stage recurrence. But we're using information that was obtained from the Department of Water Resources. So I think I can say with confidence it's the best that's available today, and I can get you the answer of how far back
I'm just curious about, is it covering the significant wet periods if you're getting that from DWR? And then, I think you brought it up, what's the effect of this going forward if, we have climate change, how's that going to affect it?
Right.
I just had a couple of quick questions just in interpreting information. And when you looked at the effects on Grizzly Island, having, a probability of 16.2%, that's a pretty high frequency of occurrence. And were you surprised at all at some of the results of this, that everything else was down below 4% probability?
I think we were surprised by certain findings that we've come across. Against the backdrop, there have been 158 levee failures in the Delta since 1900. So it's, one can say that levee failures are fairly characteristic of the Delta, although the most recent failure, I believe, was 2004, Jones Island. So there hasn't been a failure for 12 years or so, and there's been only 1 or 2 failures in the past 3 decades, which is, I think, is an indication, first of all, that the attention that's being paid to the Delta through the subventions and special projects programs of the DWR have had an impact on increasing the reliability of the levees in the Delta. There's a number of other factors that come into play, I think, and these are anecdotal and perhaps judgmental, but certainly the Delta has been characterized by heroic flood fighting, and our numbers that describe the probability of failure don't really take into account in a very easy way human intervention like flood fighting, and so that's a factor that's judgmental. It must be considered, but it also must be weighed against the possibility that if you're depending on flood fighting and you can't get there for some reason because of the weather conditions or whatever, then you can't really rely on your ability to flood fight. So there's this is a very complex regime, and but I think we've characterized it in a way that does enable us to accurately evaluate relative risk throughout the Delta. But good question.
Yeah,
Can I just add to that?
Sure.
Just very briefly, one of the things, I don't know if it would be considered surprising or not, but just looking at the islands on a relative basis, one of the things I think that we found was informative, and Larry was alluding to this with the subventions and special projects. We collected some data on where state money had been spent on levees over the past decade or so. So one of the things that we found were areas that had, lower risk or that we were seeing improvements, there had been significant state investments. And so Grizzly Island was actually probably not one of the top ones that was receiving state funding. So in that sense, maybe it's not such a surprise.
So the relative condition, the physical condition of the individual islands and the levees is part of the risk assessment that you're doing, that's part of the data that you have, or is that more?
The individual islands, yes. I'm sorry, that was part of your question. We're looking on a
Or just, I mean, is there variation in the physical conditions of the existing levees that
definitely
are part of your analysis?
Yes, all the levees are
and
unique.
Which is, one of my, hey, this is a basic question, just
No, good
since I'm
question.
new.
Yeah, and if I could add to that, though, I mean, the team has coordinated with the engineers for the reclamation districts on a lot of that. What are the conditions of the levees? What are the fragility curves? But fragility curves are a complex thing to develop, and they're not easily developed. But where we can, we have adjusted them as appropriate to accommodate understanding of the local conditions.
Okay, no, that's great. I just had one last, if people will indulge me. On the habitat, on the analysis on the habitat, it's existing habitat. Are you taking into account what may happen in the future through eco-restore or mitigation for water fix, or what may be there, or what the conditions may be like in the future?
Yeah, the risk calculation here looks at the existing habitat and conservation easements, and it actually looks at the high-value habitat and conservation easements. We do have a data set that looks at future potential, sort of what is the opportunity, and it's based on the information in the Delta Plan and information about elevations. That is primarily going to come in a future step where we look at where are the priorities for investment. We want to flag the ones that have potential for habitat so that you're not armoring a levee where there's habitat potential. So that's the primary use of it. We do have that data set of where is there potential for particularly aquatic or riparian habitat. So you want to think about what kinds of risk reduction you do where there's a habitat opportunity.
Okay, no, thank you. Great presentation.
Mary?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Two quick questions. Just with your outreach program, what do you suspect a timeline will be before we're going to see you back here with some sort of a final report? I think the staff agenda says coming months. I mean, I'm just out of curiosity, 3 months, 4 months?
You're referring to the final methodology
Yeah.
report? We're actually finalizing that portion of it right now, and that report is only going to include up to the risk calculations, which we're finalizing right now. So we hope to finalize that within the next month.
Okay, and then what about the prioritization of the islands and the tracks that is part of the community outreach process, or are they married together?
Yeah, the community outreach we're doing within June also, so we're hoping to, any feedback that we get that changes, if there's new best available data that for some reason we weren't aware of, we'd have to incorporate that, but that would be within the risk analysis portion of it. And what we're really looking at for the final methodology is just the inventory of assets and information that we've gathered, along with the probability of failures that we've calculated up to that point. Any risk analysis will be not in this next methodology report, but that'll be in a final one coming towards the end of the year.
Dustin, if I could add. So in addition to that, kind of as Dustin said, sort of validating the underlying data and information, the outreach in June and probably into July is also to explore with people how do they respond to this risk information? How would they see relative priorities of these risks? Because we want to get their input to help inform you as you think about relative priorities. And so I think, Dan, you can correct me, but you're talking July or August to come back
Yeah,
here.
I think it probably depends on partly on what we hear from folks.
Right,
how
depends on the
complex that message is.
Right.
But we're hopeful we could bring some preliminary suggestions perhaps in July so that you would be able to react to them, and we might have be closer to making a recommendation for action that you could consider in August or September.
Okay, that's awesome. And then I would encourage you to meet with the Delta County Coalition as a group to make a presentation directly with them.
Yep.
Certainly would be very valuable. And I know, Mr. Chairman, there's a public comment letter that you're going to address, but I would certainly hope we have staff provide responses to us as how those concerns will be addressed through this process, because I think they're important.
They'll highlight that during the public comment period.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Just have
Asia?
one question and a comment. Comment-wise, we received just recently, the council, during the meeting, a comment from a constituent, Nikki Schward. She is the managing member of Snug Harbor Resorts, LLC, located on a peninsula in Ryer Island in Solano County, and her questions were relating to the accuracy of the baseline data, which also sparked a couple questions of my own. And so I just wanted to know, I know with GIS we use the shape files and whatever data that we use, that's what we go with, but is there a process in place to manually check the data and those assumptions, because those would drastically affect our risk analysis, and if there will be corrections made between now and the community meeting with the data, could that information also be shared with the council, just relative to the preliminary information that we've received? And I'll just give one example that Ms. Schward used, which is, and I urge, and I'm sure the chair, it's up to him if he would like to share this information publicly, but I think it's really helpful because you also used illustrative examples.
It is public information.
Okay, I wasn't sure. Okay.
And staff has filled out a blue card when we get to public comment. I was going to highlight, but proceed.
Okay. My apology, Mr. Chair. But one example that she used was the DRMS Phase 1 falsely listed Ryer North as flooded in 1986, but it had not flooded in over 100 years. And so there was an error with the flood that was actually calculated within that risk analysis. So I just wanted to make sure that there would be a way to verify some of the data.
Well, as part of our public workshops, we are going to take, any changes in information into account, and a lot of that would be, regarding the specific assets, if there's, like I said, new available information out there. As far as that specific example, whether an island had flooded or not, that probably wouldn't affect our analysis directly, because ours is really based more on, these statistical probabilities, so it's not really a specific event, but more of the, the integration of probabilities. But we're definitely welcome to information, and that's what we're hoping to get with our public outreach meetings. We want to, without diving too much into how that's going to happen, we're going to have a team of the consultants there along with council staff at the public workshops to actually walk people through, the details and the calculations and the information we have. And so we'll have, requests for information back from the public that we'll try to incorporate. If there is something, that affects our analysis, we definitely want to know about it.
And the data you're seeing now in these displays has already been vetted with the Reclamation District engineers and a variety of other sources. So we've already gone through and made some adjustments to reflect detailed knowledge they have that wasn't incorporated in the original sources we turned to.
Okay, and just my last comment is really on the real estate values. I know that would drastically affect the asset valuation, so I just want to make certain that we're using the most current real estate values as well for those valuations, and also the current utility data. Thank you.
We should talk about that a little bit, because I think there's continues to be some confusion. If you bear with me for a second, the National Research Council defines 4 types of cost or money losses that arise from disasters. The first is impacts of disasters, which are both market and non-market effects. They talk about losses of disasters, which include direct losses, physical destruction of property or physical impairment of property, and indirect losses, which would be business interruption as an example, or salary interruption as an example. There's the cost of disasters, a third type, and that's what's paid out by either insurers or the government or perhaps both. And then there are damages caused by disasters, and those are the direct losses by physical destruction. For example, buildings that are destroyed, crops that are lost. We are focused in our study on the last, which is in keeping with the recommendations of the National Research Council. So we're looking at direct physical losses from disaster. So if you take a typical residential home site, it's the value of the home and its belongings, any vehicles that might be associated with it, but it's not the value of the underlying land. The presumption, of course, is that the floodwaters recede, the land is still there, could be built on again, and the actual loss to the owner of that parcel is the physical buildings and vehicles or crops if it's a farm, and those are what we're counting. So in terms of real estate value, I want to make it really clear, we're not looking at the real estate values of what a particular home parcel may sell for on the open market. It's just the value of the improvements that could be damaged in a flood.
To further that explanation, and for Ken and Asia's benefit, describe the difference between the values associated with a parcel of improvements from the county assessor's rolls versus the number of buildings that may exist on a particular parcel. We've had this discrepancy that's come up many times, and I think Nikki Swart identifies this. My recollection is that you're using county parcel maps that may have more than one building, and so the number of buildings on a particular island may not line up with the number of parcels with buildings.
That's right.
So clarify that, because that's an ongoing question.
I think that was well described, Mr. Chair. But in addition, it's not only just the structure, physical value of the structures itself, but it's related to the depth of flooding. And FEMA and the Corps of Engineers provide information to be able to judge the percent of damage from zero to total destruction, depending on the depth of floodwaters at that particular parcel. And this is probably a good time to indicate that we're somewhat hamstrung, perhaps by limitations to doing exact evaluation. Because, for example, when we make that calculation of the amount of damage per depth of flooding, we're making an assumption that the depth of flooding across a particular polder or a particular island is constant. And yet we know that there's some variation in elevations throughout the site, but that would be a level of detail that would require a significant amount of effort to get that information and then to apply it. And the question then becomes, really, have you improved your knowledge and understanding of the kind of damages that are going to occur during a flood by chasing down every last particular detail, or can you be satisfied with, again, I emphasize the relative risk of flooding, and if we're making the same kinds of assumptions consistently throughout the Delta, I think it's defensible that we're able to characterize the relative risk quite accurately, and the question would become, I think, would be these types of questions become very important if you're going to compare the Delta to another geography in the United States. Let's compare it to Louisiana, or to New Orleans in particular, is the level of detail done for that particular flood damage study consistent with the level of detail that we're using? Well, perhaps not, because there's differences in how they were approached. So it probably wouldn't be fair to compare across geographies, apples and apples. But within the Delta, within the geography that we're characterizing, we think that this approach does give us high confidence that we have a relatively good understanding of risk to the extent that we can make decisions regarding priorities, and we can evaluate the cost effectiveness of repairs, improvements, to begin to reduce those risks.
So I think Asia and Ken each had questions.
Question, is there a difference in the valuation calculation for residential and commercial or other land uses? Because generally, commercial or industrial land uses use a obsolescence devaluation in contrast to residential uses. So will it be two different calculations for value?
I'm sorry, I couldn't answer that question. I'll get you the answer to that. I'm sorry.
Okay. Ken, did you have a?
Oh, yeah, just I'm trying to interpret. Oh, I'm sorry. Interpreting the data again on habitat and water supply, the risk assessment, relative risk is just frequency of occurrence of the flooding, not like with property, the extent of the damage that may be done to the habitat or done to water conveyance. It's just that this is the frequency of occurrence.
That's right. And
okay.
This has been a topic of particular interest to a lot of people, and it's something that the team has spent a great deal of time on, both with council staff as well as staff from DWR. And because of the complexities of water supply throughout California, issues like antecedent conditions, does a particular levee fail when the terminal reservoirs are full in Southern California, or are we in a drought situation that affects not only water supply from the Delta, but affects water supply from the Colorado River and from the Owens Valley? These are all hugely important factors that are exceedingly difficult to ascertain. Our hopes going into it, I think, were that we would actually be able to monetize what the cost of water supply disruption would be. But as we pursued that, again, with DWR in particular, we just found that they haven't done it. It's just an exceedingly difficult calculation to make, because it's so highly dependent on antecedent conditions. And within the Delta, it's been argued that if a levee on an island on one side were to fail, as opposed to the other side of the island, there might actually be a benefit to water quality. And so there were just so many factors to take into consideration that we felt that this was an appropriate way to look at the risk to water supply, to focus in, because we're basically, our unit of measurement is an island. And so if we look at an island and we judge its importance to water supply because of either user function or the amount of water that goes by it that gets put to beneficial use somewhere else, that would be a reasonable factor to use in consideration, and then tied with probability of flooding ought to give us some indication of the level of risk that we face in that particular metric.
Okay. Thank you.
Mary?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dustin, I think you mentioned two meetings that were coming up, June 6th and June 9th.
That's correct.
One in Brentwood and one in West Sac.
Yes.
Are there other meetings scheduled?
We do not what we would call public workshops. We are going to be reaching out to specific stakeholders targeted by topic. So we're going to be meeting specifically with water users, flood experts, environmental experts. So we are going to be having specific topic meetings with our technical resources.
And I think Brentwood is a lovely place, so I don't want my words to be misconstrued, but I don't think folks would consider that a Delta community like maybe the city of Oakley or other communities might be in and around the Delta. So if you want a Delta draw or if you want to talk to Delta people about this, the venue may not be hitting the mark as highly as it could have. So for additional outreach, maybe consider another location or maybe even a central Delta location. And then lastly, if we're doing outreach or notification or invitations, I'd love to have copies of them and I can share them with my friends and family, so to speak, and see if we can help garner some participation at the events.
I don't, we were working on the notifications and such yesterday. I'm not sure if that actually hit out on our listserv yet, but I believe it's out today. Okay,
Yeah.
So we do have those.
If you could share it, that'd be great.
Yeah, and regarding the locations, we definitely welcome the suggestions. Part of our limitation on this one was trying to fast track and the available venues to
Sure.
work with
It gets complicated.
technology.
That's why event planners get paid very well.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, any other comments or questions from the council? Do we have any public comment requests? While Pat's bringing that up, I will reiterate the 9-page letter that we received from Nikki Sward, essentially calling out that there are 2 Ryer Islands, Ryer North, Ryer Sassoon, and questions about the asset data that's being used. So Nikki, if you are listening, there will be an opportunity either in Brentwood or West Sacramento to attend those public hearings and an opportunity to meet with staff and share in detail your concerns. Nikki was very instrumental as we were developing the Delta Plan and helping us identify errors in mapping. So I know she, for 2 or 3 years, invested a lot of time and helped us a lot. So we'll look forward to hearing more from her. Next public comment request, Eric Ringelberg. Welcome, Eric.
Thank you, Chair and council members. Eric Ringelberg here for the Freshwater Trust and the local agencies of the North Delta. This is the first time speaking for the Freshwater Trust. We're a California-based nonprofit focused on quantified conservation. So I want to start off with thanking both Larry and Dustin for pointing out the success of the Special Projects Program and the heroic local flood fighting and efforts to reduce the actual rate of levee failure from the expected rate of levee failure. That success built on several decades of effective collaboration between DWR and the reclamation districts. A bottom-up process I think has been highly successful, as you can see by the numbers. It's good to see the initial work products. Been long awaiting this initial analysis and really look forward to seeing some of the synthesis products from the team. And despite our concerns about some of the methodological approaches, I'm glad to see some of the comments that Land in particular made that were taken and actually implemented in this round. So the Freshwater Trust has a variety of analytical and modeling tools that we think can complement and inform this process moving forward, in particular for the habitat. So looking forward to our 2 work group meetings. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Any other requests? Very good. Then Dustin, unless your team has anything further to add, I think that concludes file item number 10. Okay, thank you all very much. Look forward to more in the future. File item number 11, public comment on any matter. Seeing none, we will move to adjourn the meeting. Thank you all very much for coming.